Hello, welcome to another GeoTech Hour. We're honored to have a great panel today that's going to be discussing the topic of tech-enabled dis and misinformation, social platforms, and geopolitics. This is something that increasingly over the last few years, more and more of us are becoming aware that these are challenges we have to face. And in particular, it is the choices in how we use technologies that can influence whether or not misinformation and disinformation go more viral or not, whether it is more susceptible to being shared and becoming a part of a very fabric that ends up pulling us apart, or if we can find ways to be more cohesive and bring our societies together. I'm excited to have the panel together, and this is a special joint GeoTech Hour that we're doing with our colleagues at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. To such end, I'd like to welcome Rose. Rose, welcome to this special joint GeoTech Hour that we're doing together. Could you share a little bit about both yourself and what DFRL is doing, and then your thoughts about why we should be talking about these issues now and why this has come to the forefront of addressing these concerns with society?
Certainly. Thank you so much for co-hosting this with us and everyone for joining today. The Digital Forensic Research Lab was really created out of the moment of public consciousness and awareness around the problem of mis and disinformation around the world. Misinformation has certainly existed for, let's just say, all of human history. And even in Russia and its environs prior to the 2016 election in the United States, which is when I think for the United States and much of the world, it became a kitchen table issue with lots of people asking about Russian bots and learning the language of mis and disinformation, paying attention to it in a different way. So DFR Lab was created and really helped to build an industry along with it, doing forensic research to separate fact from fiction, understand the mechanisms through which people are weaponizing the information space and making use of social media platforms and other tools to spread narratives for any number of reasons that serve their purposes, political, financial, or otherwise, as well as understanding where those fit in with misinformation, where there's not necessarily an intentional coordinated plan to push false information or problematic narratives, but those things tend to tie together. So, we're obviously happy that more people are engaging with this conversation and trying to understand where tech is the piece of accelerant to these issues, where humans are core, and understanding how this fits in society, not just in the United States, but around the world, again, where a lot of these issues began in the first place. So just to say, I think when we talk about these things, it's important to understand that a lot of the platforms we're focused on didn't start with the plan of being massive scaled worldwide core architecture for the conduct of politics and business and daily life. And so, if we go with the usual phrase that tech is not neutral, it certainly has human bias built into it. And any tech that is developed either without intentional thought around its design or with bad intentional thought around its design is going to have outcomes in society that we don't like. And I think a lot of the platforms we end up talking about in this conversation certainly fit into that. And they're scrambling over time to figure out how to put the genie back in the bottle on a number of things that they made decisions about years ago that have massive ramifications. I think that in this conversation, it's important to think about the growth of online ads and how few restrictions there are, particularly in the United States, where many of these companies are home, for how those ads can hoover up data, sell that data, make use of that data without many people knowing how or why, driving the business models and decision-making that often exacerbates the trends we're talking about, with algorithms driving virality and preferencing toxic content, not because any platform has a desire necessarily to spread that particular content, but because it performs well, it brings eyes in and generates clicks. And then I think a third thing that's important to just underline as we start this conversation is that expanded access to the internet around the world, while a wonderful thing for people to have access to new economies and better connectivity to education, all sorts of positives, also comes with a double-edged sword that there are more and more people online existing in these unfettered ecosystems, and that feeds the problems of mis and disinformation. All of which is to say, I think we risk sometimes having this conversation from an exclusively American standpoint, which misses a really big piece of the picture, both in that the companies may be predominantly American companies, but they exist all over the world, in some cases serving almost as the de facto internet for people in places like Myanmar, which just experienced a coup this past week, all around Asia and a number of other countries. And often are even more poorly resourced and more poorly attended to in terms of how companies think about the issue of mis and disinformation and their responsibility in grappling with the challenges. So as troubling as some of the trends may be here in the United States and Europe, imagine being someone on the ground in Uganda, watching a misinformation network. We recently uncovered through DFR Lab, just as an example, that the Ministry of Information itself from the government of Uganda in the midst of an election was leveraging an inauthentic network that it was coordinating through Facebook and Twitter to attack the opposition. Imagine how hard it is to be someone on the ground there seeing those things and trying to get the attention of companies and governments and the certain resources that we would bring to bear here in the United States. So just to bring that international frame to the conversation, but I'll pass it over for everyone else. I'm excited that we're having this discussion and look forward to the rest of the panelists' comments.
Very compelling, Rose, and really appreciate how you set the scene very nicely. That you know that a lot of these, we never intended for these platforms to be where politics and a lot of virality and things were occurring. Nevertheless, they are. If I could ask a real quick rejoinder before we shift to Pablo, you know, one of the things I know that you're very passionate about is that we need to start thinking about, you know, human rights and how we maintain, if not extend and continue human rights. Do you think that we may be facing an era that in this world in which we are increasingly in this information sphere that surrounds us, are there new types of human rights that we need to think about adding here? And I know that may be hard to do very briefly, but maybe just as a teaser that we can explore and unpack later, what would be your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I actually think we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, you know, if you want to get really nerdy and wonky and look at the 1948 documents put forward, it's actually an incredibly durable set of values and shared universal, what do we believe as individuals, regardless of where you live in the world, are basic fundamental rights that you should have. And I think they translate quite well to the digital era, but it is our responsibility to intentionally and directly translate them to the digital era. And I think if we were to do that, we'd have a different conversation about expectations of privacy and transparency, expectations of what we as individuals can know about who's collecting what information for what purposes and where it goes, which perhaps helps us a little bit move away from what can be a confusing conversation just about ad markets and ad buying and business models that I think people's eyes gloss over. But I do think at the end of the day, if we fail to answer those questions about our rights online, matching the basic principles we would expect offline, that we do risk existing in a digital world that resembles nothing I personally would want to live in.
Excellent. Thank you, Rose. So now I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Pablo Brewer. One, congratulations on getting your PhD, and I know that's a big milestone. And two, you've done a lot of work addressing the challenges of cybersecurity, misinformation, disinformation, and have a lot of deep experience there. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Pablo. Why is this something that we're talking about now as opposed to, say, 2010, 2000? I mean, why is this coming to the forefront of society now?
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that's been interesting is that as communications technology has gone out, in previous incantations of this, what changed was what a known speaker or an authentic source, their reach for an audience. So we went from writing caves on the walls to handwriting manuscripts that could be carried by horseback riders to the printing press where we could mass produce books. But still, it required a lot of capital, and it required that you be somebody in a position of power to put out these messages. And as late as, you know, the 1980s and the 1990s, if you were an American, you got your news from ABC, CBS, and NBC. And if you were in the UK, you got it from BBC and a couple of other known channels. But you couldn't just show up and reach the mass audience because you wanted to. You had to be somebody of import, somebody that had been vetted with a message that was authentic. And what happened with social media is we democratized the ability to reach a mass audience. And now we live in a world where an entertainer has twice the number of followers as the president of the United States and 50 times the number of followers of the prime minister of Britain. And they don't have to clear their message with anyone. They can say something completely false. And so I think we really didn't consider what that meant. When the internet was created, it was very much created with the idea of giving everybody a voice, but that includes the people that are not so nice as well. And so perhaps we didn't put the proper guardrails there. And one of the things that happened is it became kind of a perfect storm of late, particularly in the West. Now, why was it a perfect storm? Well, first of all, most people in the West now tend to get their news from social media. And one of the things that happens in social media is, unlike other social networks, physical social networks, is the predominant characteristic is we break links faster than we form links. You know, if you think about a typical social network, you have more friends towards the end of your life than you do at the beginning of your life because you've met more people, you have more work contacts. Well, in social media, what happens is you tend to unfollow people that don't espouse the views that you have. And so your social network actually gets smaller and more radicalized. You end up in this echo chamber self-radicalizing. So that's the first thing that happened. The next thing that happened is the funding model in Silicon Valley of the free internet means that they have to sell ads. And the more targeted the ads are, the more money that you can make off selling those ads. And so you end up in this space where the social media networks and the service providers end up hoovering a tremendous amount of information about their users. And they end up being targeted these ads. Now, if you're a psychological operations operative, this is a treasure trove of information. And it's more information you could ever hope for if the amount of data that Facebook collected was collected by, say, the National Security Agency, there would be an armed revolution, in Western Europe and the United States. There's no argument about that. So I think that funding model of selling the psyche of users where they become the product is really, it's just morally unsustainable. And then the last thing that happens is that in the West, we tend to have democracies. And in order for democracies to work, and Bruce and I wrote a wonderful paper on this, democracies need certain fundamental things in order to survive. And those really come down to common knowledge. The average citizen has got to believe in legitimacy of their leaders. They've got to believe in the transparency of the process. And they've got to have certain understanding of how their government works. And if any of those things fails, then the democracy fails. Autocratic systems, by the other hand, what they need is they need to hold a monopoly on information. And so while Western democracies are uniquely vulnerable to these kind of misinformation attacks, they utterly fail in autocratic governments. So it really was kind of a perfect storm of all of these things coming together at the same time that led us to a place that we never thought we would get to.
Very well said, Pablo. And maybe as a quick rejoinder, you talked a little bit about the freemium model of the internet. That, I mean, again, we get a lot of things for free, but that comes with a hidden cost. I mean, do we need to come up with new models that ideally, sort of like as Rose was talking about, that we need to think about how we ideally steer things to more good choice as opposed to the alternative? Do you have thoughts about, like, if we were to try and do one or two things going forward, and again, unfortunately, you have to do very short with your remarks here, what might you do to address the fact that maybe the money that is being made from misinformation is causing it to be a big issue of concern nowadays?
Well, to steal a bad quote from a Marine, everything's perfect, we can attack in any direction. So there's a really interesting fight that's going on now between Apple and Facebook. And Apple's point of view, and you can argue about why they're saying it, but they're saying, look, you're collecting far more information about users than you need to sell ads. And we want to inform the users. I think users should be informed in very clear language what information is being collected about them, how that information is being used, who it's being sold to. So that's the first one. The second one is, I think it really is time to revisit Section 230. Whether they want to admit it or not, really, social media in the West has become a media. And so they need to be held to the same standards as regular media companies, which means if there is a paid political ad, we need to know that it was a paid political ad and who paid for it. Because knowing who the sources of the information allows us to ingest it with the right filter and make sure that we categorize it correctly. And the last one is, and you're just starting to see inklings of this, privacy is the next luxury product. So certainly I can log on to Google and I can get a free Gmail account or log on to Microsoft Office and get a Hotmail account. But there are lots of people that are willing to pay $25 a year to companies like Proton Mail to have secure private email. And I think that that is going to be the next luxury product. And you're starting to see inklings of that where big companies like Apple are trying to sell that as a feature to their ecosystem that we offer privacy. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We just need to do it more quickly.
Very well said. And I'm reminded of that famous song, More Money, No Problems. So I appreciate that, Pablo. I would like now to go to Sarah Jane Terp, SJ, longtime friend of the GeoTech Center. Glad to have you back here. You've done a lot in this space. I guess, to sort of do an additional extent as to why is this becoming to the forefront now, maybe if you could actually stretch us a little bit about your experiences, because you've seen this train coming for a long time and you're doing a lot on it. Like, how have we gotten here?
Yeah, I mean, I've been officially working on disinformation since, I think, 2013. I was working with a European Union project called FEME. At the time, we were tracking fallacious memes, and we couldn't get enough data. I mean, people are going to laugh if you hear that now. Then back in 2016, when events happened, I looked for how I could help. Everybody else was talking about fake news, and it was like, that is not your problem, guys. Part of my background is security. So it's okay, this is not your problem. This looks like a mass scale event. How do we start dealing with this? Can we reapply security practice techniques to get responses happening faster? Mm-hmm. Fast forward via a whole bunch of work on standards. So Pablo and I built the AMET series of standards, and with the CogSec CoLab, the group that we run, put those into tool links that are used by information security people. So there are now disinformation versions of information security tools. But more importantly, we were looking at TTP, so techniques. How do you talk about disinformation behaviors? How do you list those disinformation behaviors? And how do you list countermeasures and mitigations against those behaviors? So you end up with TTPs both for the disinformation producers, but also for the disinformation responders. So we've extended that out, now looking at disinformation as a risk management thing. So how do you treat it as not just a digital harm, but how do you treat it with risk management tool links? And how do you extend that? So a lot of what we were worried about originally was scaling. The disinformation creators are quite often coordinated. The responses were anything but coordinated. So we're working on things like how to produce standards for how you rapidly share information about events, machine readable, human readable. How do you produce standards for common language? I mean, lingua franca, as Pablo puts it, about disinformation events. And how do you link those together? So current work, looking at how you build connected series of security operation centers that are either disinformation security operation centers or disinformation desks embedded in existing InfoSec centers, which I guess that was a lot of talking. Can I talk about the problem now?
Yes, you can definitely talk about, well, and actually, maybe if I could ask you about this problem, because you if there was a grand dame of countering misinformation, you are that. You are sort of almost the godmother of this counter misinformation field. We've seen it go from initially like nation states doing it to now politicians doing it, to now it just seems like corporations are doing it.
Well, okay, so that's where I was going to start. Basically, recent, I mean, if we're talking about, this is about what's happened recently. Disinformation is coming from inside the house. What we're seeing is this move past the Russians are coming to a more honest discussion about, financial motivations, political motivations, reputational drivers of disinformation. And this is, it's democratic in its own way. It's like everything's an opportunity for misinformation and anyone can join in. So things like, selling t-shirts with QAnon conspiracies on is still a part of the campaign. The number of unwitting agents is pretty high. I think we were talking beforehand about, mobs are made out of your neighbors. There are lots of different actors, quite often in exactly the same space, all operating at the same time. Another thing that I think is important, and Rose has already talked about privacy, is that there is this interaction, the system interaction between privacy, democracy, and disinformation. And we need to study that more. We need to think more about how things like privacy affect disinformation, affect countering, and can help with countering. And in the context of things like how, if you have more privacy, that reduces the amount of targeting can be done. There's stuff in the ad tech space. Earlier work over at GDI was how do we take the money out of disinformation? So disinformation sites, disinformation, then people making money off that merchandise. GDI still does good work on that. We're seeing, I think, on the counter side, we're seeing a lot more will to act on the part of technology providers and platforms. And we're starting to see those mitigations countermeasures. It's gone from a year ago running a workshop about countermeasures and putting up the very first line was detect alongside the other six countermeasure Ds, just because people need to get out of the system. I think we've moved from the main countermeasures being we educate people and we take down the botnets to a much wider sense of this is an information ecosystem. So there's a sense that we're not just focused on the disinformation, we're focused on improving the information. So things like information deserts, where people go to spaces where they expect to find information, and if it isn't there, the disinformation moves in. The pink slime of networks, of fake news accounts, for example. And we're seeing some really interesting countermeasures. I mean, we mapped 160 odd of them, but we're seeing, like, in practice, the K-pop stands of flooding disinformation hashtags and space. It's crude, it's effective.
Yep.
But we're seeing more sophisticated techniques. For example, the virality team creates counter narratives, uses advertising to get those counter narratives into disinformation bearing spaces. Again, it's thinking about these as ecosystems, and we're seeing a lot more groups. I've spent a lot of this week, actually, we're writing reports, so I'm spending my time doing data, looking at groups around the world. So looking for who's in each country, mapping them out, about to start doing some work with the UN on sparking up more of this. And we're starting to see them talk to each other. So that dream of having this joined up response of lots of different types of group, lots of different types of response, all acting together, it's starting to come. Sorry, I talked too much.
No, that was great, SJ. You gave us a wonderful history, and there's a lot there to continue to unpack. We're going to circle back because we've gotten a lot of Q&As, but I'm going to go real quick to Bevan, who I know is also a longtime friend of the GeoTech Center. And Bevan, really glad to have you here because you actually had a solution that, unfortunately, and it was the right solution. I mean, it was people were in control of their data. It was GDPR compliant. It was a social media platform that was in use in 100 different countries. And this was 2018. And you found that people still wanted to go to the other platforms that were doing other things with your data. So maybe first, Bevan, if you could introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you did in 2018 and what you take away from that and trying to do a social media platform where people are in control of their data.
Hey, thank you, David. This is a great session so far, and thank you for inviting me here today. So in early 2016, we launched a first GDPR social media platform called Hashdiv. We were very successful in the beginning. We were adding tools. So we had the way we moderated the platform is we created a bill of rights for users. And we would always review them and make sure that they were kept up to date every year based on some of the changes that's been happening in the industry, and make sure that we stay compliant to help out our users and give users the full control. The platform had no bots, and it was truly driven by the content on the platform and the information that the people were discussing or sharing with the platform. And we were able to create a great traction, but with something as big as a social media network, it takes lots of fuel to get it from one point to the next and then in orbit. So, and because you can't you can't rely on advertisements in the beginning. You got to rely on the quality of the product and what it does and what it stands for, and who we support with the product. So that's a little bit on what we did with the platform. So we had to shelf it for a while, but we're also looking to possibly relaunch it in the future, given the right information and the right tools, and hearing a lot of what Pablo had to say earlier about the collection of data with Facebook and how they're over collecting data for what purpose. So we have to figure out why they're collecting it, if they're storing it, and what they're using it for. But this also gives room for other products and other businesses to take flight in correcting the mistakes that Facebook and other social media platforms are currently making. Because at one point, MySpace was a big thing, and no one thought that MySpace could be dethroned at any given moment, and then they were, and now they're not here. So I think there's lots of room for new companies and new businesses and new ideas to hit the market and kind of put a change or a spin on things where the user is not the commodity, right? We're not extracting value from the users just because they're a part of the network. There's other ways to take a look at social media networks to extract value from it without taxing the users or collecting their personal information for as we don't know as yet what they're doing with all of this information, because it's a lot, especially when you own multiple social media networks, such as, Instagram and, the messaging app. I don't want to name them by names, but it's a conglomerate of them. And you can really, think about all the capabilities they have with all the data they're collecting, and how possibly, if they're hacked, the implications of the negative effect globally as well. So we need to take a look at how checks and balances for these companies. And we also need to share or let users know exactly what the data is being collected for and how it's being used, and possibly even a value added for them at the end. So they're not being taken advantage of, and they feel like it's an equal share across the board, because data collection is sometimes really, really good, because it helps you figure out what you're looking for, or bring things to you that you might be thinking about, and there it is. So there's a lot of good uses for it, and then there's also a lot of negative uses for it at the same time. And I think the negative use outweighs a lot of the good. But social media networks are a great thing for us, because it brings us a lot closer together. It brings down borders, and it helps us share information and open our eyes on new situations that are currently happening in different countries, and how people are living in those countries as well. So it's a great tool to bring the world together, make it a smaller place, but also it can be very damaging. So I think these conversations right now that we're having is very important to create the next building blocks for something that could be for the people instead of for profit. And I find it very difficult. I think it's very difficult for current social media platforms to change directions, because they're public, they have shareholders, they have a business model that they can't change. And Facebook actually reported negative value on not promoting as many political ads this season as tend to before. So there's lots of changes coming, and I think these conversations are great as we move forward.
So real quick, Bevan, and there's a lot that you said that I really appreciate you sharing your insights with as a CEO in this space that is trying to innovate ways to give people control or choice over their data. We actually have a question that came from the audience that said, is it time for a personal data bill of rights to give individuals control over their personal data? You've actually done this. I mean, you did this with what you were thinking about. Maybe real quick, and maybe like in a short 45, 60-second answer, what would you think would be so key in terms of making sure people have choice associated with their data?
Pablo touched on it before, is making it transparent. So transparency is definitely the key, right? Letting people know exactly what they're getting into, letting them know exactly what their data is being used for, how it's being used. And also, I think one of the biggest problems that we have out there are third-party uses of the data, if they're sharing the data with third-party, and how secure the third-party infrastructure is as they communicate with each other to help each other grow. So I think there's a big pain point there that needs to be taken, we need to take a look at. And I believe we also need a tool to help identify and show to the people who are signing up what they're signing up to, and if it's either good for them or bad for them, or it could cause problems down the road. So I think these things need to be front and center. And I think there should be laws to let consumers know exactly the type of website it is. So it's not too late after you spend time on the website and thinking, oh, ooh, I made a mistake, because a lot of people don't read the fine print, and before they know it, a lot of their information is collected and they've agreed to it. So we need a platform to identify these companies who are misusing information, and kind of like a Equifax.
Yep.
To show that these companies are great, these third parties are good. They don't, basically their track record on how well they perform in the industry and how trusted they are with people's information and data. So I think if we have a standard and not let government control it, I think everybody would have to adhere to this, and it would be very simple moving forward.
Thank you, Bevan. All right, so team, we have 12 Q&As already. So we're going to have to shift a little bit early to lightning Q&A. It's not lightning round, but it's lightning Q&A. And I'm going to go first to Pablo with a question that we have from Jonathan asking about, should the US bring back an an information agency to counter disinformation? We had one during the Cold War. We thought the Cold War was over, so we did away with this. Should we have that? And what checks should be put in place to make sure future administrations don't label anything they don't like as fake news? So with that, you have 90 seconds on the clock, Pablo.
Well, I'm glad that was an easy question to start out with. So the short answer is yes. I think we need two things brought back to government. One is a U.S. information agency, and I think it should be a public-private partnership with people from industry that includes representatives from social media and regular media and concerned citizens. I think that's the best way to do it, because the reality is that the way we're getting this misinformation in a lot of cases is through social media, privately held companies. The other thing I think we need is, and there was another question that came in about how do we regulate technology when it changes so fast? We used to have a nonpartisan office called the Office of Technical Assessments, and their job was to advise government officials on things of concern with technology, to help educate them on potential problems and the technologies. And we haven't had one of those since, I believe, the mid-1990s. And I think we really need that back. We need a nonpartisan group that really understands technologies to be able to explain it to lawmakers.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Pablo, and very concise answer. Appreciate it. I'm now going to shift to Rose. So we have another question. This is coming from Benjamin, who asked the question about, are there potential dangers of cracking down on extremist voices on social media? Could these dangers potentially outweigh the benefits of engaging in such a crackdown? So 90 seconds on the clock for you.
Solve world problems, right?
Right.
I think it's helpful to separate two things. So number one, I think it's unquestionably helpful and frankly, abhorrently too late to have moved in taking some of the worst offenders of mis and disinformation, particularly that were pushing people towards violent action, offline. Part of that being that your grandmother not having access to a flood of algorithmically driven groups and content that takes her from frustration over an election into a space of believing that there are space lasers and that they need to storm the Capitol is a good thing. What that means then is there is absolutely a risk that you get the most extreme portions of society existing in more and more protected spaces that are in fact harder to track, which may get you into a debate about encryption. And just to call this out, because I think it's important, the conversation we're having on Section 230 right now, which unfortunately becomes the only policy conversation we have for everything we're frustrated about on the internet, does risk. I think we actually have to say these things together. If we believe there needs to be strong encryption, which is important for human rights activists the world over, and for us as citizens who believe in the protection of our own information, and for a secure internet, then there is a risk that we have to accept, be clear about it, but be okay with it, that you are moving the potential for the most extreme people into spaces that you then have to look like law enforcement and intelligence agents who do the work around the world in finding bad people in bad places to try and prevent them from doing bad things. But treating the entirety of the internet as a completely unmitigated, unregulated space because you're concerned about having to do the work of the worst people, to me seems a little crazy. But that is one opinion in what is a really important debate to be having right now.
Very well said. And maybe we can do some future collaborations together on that space, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. We've got to figure out how we don't let the extremes pull us in directions that don't make sense for the general civic norms. All right, so now I'd like to go to Bevan. This is also, we have an interesting question. You've got 60 seconds or so for a lightning round response. The question is, do you think digital literacy should be taught to youth and college age adults? And I know, Bevan, you're doing a lot in the education space, so maybe, and I know also what you did with HashDit is you actually went out to middle schoolers and high schoolers to get their feedback. So real quick, what are your thoughts about digital literacy as something that's available to youth and college age adults?
I think it's very important now, since technology is rapidly improving and increasing, so things such as like deep fakes, and anyone could add their face to any movie character or any music video and it would resemble them. So these are some of the challenges that we're facing moving forward, especially when it comes to disinformation and making things look like it's not. So when I went to middle schools and high schools, and we spoke to a lot of the teachers and the principals and the students, they have no idea of some of the landmines or potholes in some of the apps that are currently on the App Store, such as TikTok and so forth. So we need to create a model to help them understand of the dangers that's currently on the app stores, on the internet, so they can be a little bit more proficient in identifying these issues and avoiding them. So early education is very important. It doesn't have to be really in depth. It just has to be, concise to some of the dangers out there and what to look for to avoid a lot, things that you can run into problems later on in your data and so forth. So,
excellent. Thank you, Bevan, for that. Really appreciate that. We do need to recognize that a literacy component is part of this solution here, and I'm glad you emphasized it. SJ, I'd like to go to you. We have a question from Stephen who asks, can you peel back the onion associated with Facebook's oversight board? Basically, he's trying to figure out, do they actually have influence? Can they make it down? What decisions might have enormous impacts to democracy and civil society as a result of this oversight board? What would you recommend if you could play Queen for a day and help guide what that oversight board looks like? 90 seconds.
I'm glad you said Queen for a day, because I don't actually know that much about the oversight board. I wouldn't want to speak for them. I suspect Rose knows a lot more than I do. If I was Queen for a day and could look at this, I would make sure that we did things like focusing on behaviors, not people. So think about segmentation of audiences, think about segmentations of responses. I would put everything in a risk framework. Always think about the harms. So what are the harms, what severities, targets, what are those drivers? And get ahead of problems, not just respond. I mean, the oversight board, from what I can see, is like you post stuff in, they do stuff. We need something, not necessarily this board, but maybe this one, maybe something related, but something that looks at this whole ecosystem. Something that's coordinated to talk about what it means. They're going to make unpopular decisions. They're going to make unpopular decisions, but that's okay, because that's part of having a independent board. It won't always go the way that everybody wants it to go, or populations. I mean, almost it's like if everyone's shouting at you, you're probably doing the right thing.
Right.
So as Queen, more risk analysis, more focus on behavior, more getting ahead with mitigation, planning, etc., and more coordination.
Really like that. And I think you also hit on something. We almost need a misinformation foresight function that thinks about how you can get ahead of the train wrecks before the train wrecks happen. And one of the things that I know that you and Pablo have been doing, and we've been doing at the People-Centered Internet, is thinking about not just what are your obligations and your acknowledged blind spots, but then how does that flow to your responsibilities and safeguards you need to put in place, like you said, thinking about risk. So really appreciate that response, SJ, and that's a good pivot now to Rose. We have a question from Krista that says, how can policymakers develop policies for technologies that are evolving so quickly? How can we balance innovation with privacy? She's in Canada right now, and she's open to how do you do this given the state of technology is changing so quickly. 90 seconds.
Absolutely. I think it's exactly the right question. And sometimes there's a little bit of a fallacy. And certainly every time we watch, the heads of companies get called up to Capitol Hill and be asked questions about how they make money, it doesn't inspire an immense amount of confidence in the sophistication, particularly of the US government's capability of placing proper constraints. But I think when we look at principle level, rights-based level conversations, we're in a much better space on regulations. And let me say outright, I think that there is no version of the world where we end up either having technology and innovation that we want, nor societies we want to live in, if we do not take some regulatory action. I don't think there's a way around that. Now, what that looks like could look vastly different. So I've heard really interesting proposals looking at some of the pieces of how the financial industry has tried to manage the slowness of micromanagement in overly specific regulatory frameworks, having compliance officers that are supposed to report to different bodies. There are other folks that focus again on the individual rights level, where we focused on requirements of transparency so that individual researchers and journalists are able to report on what's going on, and mechanisms then for accountability on basic standards of rights. So I think these are the debates that I wish we were having, because I don't think there is a clear answer in this current moment, because good policy has to involve society and has to involve all sorts of different people that will have different interests. Bevan's a great example of this. Being a tech entrepreneur, and I've been in this place myself, when you're not of the size of Facebook, some of the conversations that we're having in the antitrust space, some of the conversations that we're having even in the content moderation space would be deadly to new innovative companies. And yet that's not a reason to not do it. So having more sophisticated discussions about the difference between scale and virality, transparency and accountability, what amount of money you are required to put into the operations of companies to do the due diligence and protecting from harm. All of those are things that we should be debating and discussing openly right now. We aren't doing it as aggressively through government as I'd like. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation here. But I think it's something that we urgently need. And if I get to just put a little plug on my international security hat, even if you're someone that doesn't care about technology or you don't care about human rights, but you're really concerned about things that you're seeing coming out of, a rising China or versions of the world that you're not a fan of in other places, this is the form of power today. This is geopolitics. So having a conversation in the United States about what we believe people's rights should be online, what their rights should be with regard to their data, and what we expect a technological sector to look like in a functioning and positive society is a form of foreign policy, and failing to engage in that conversation is failing to have foreign policy. So I'll step off my soapbox now and give it back.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it. That was a great soapbox. And I think it points to we do need to have more public discussions about where we want to go here. SJ, I'm going to merge two questions. One that we have from Tristan that says, can we identify gaps in our knowledge about how misinformation spreads? Do we have a good answer to the question, why do ordinary people get duped by fake news or misinformation? And then this is also linked to another question from Taylor, who's saying, what can the general public do on combating disinformation and misinformation while we await for lawmakers' actions? 90 seconds.
90 seconds on all of those. So how do we stop people getting duped? The mechanisms look very similar to sales funnels. It's radicalization. You bring people in with things that they know and drift them towards your topic. So same techniques work in the opposite direction. So there are groups like Steve Hassan, Dave Troy Summit working to work on this, on how you bring people back from the radicalization that is happening. And yeah, I'm using the R word, but whatever. What were the other questions?
The other question was, do we have good research why people fall for misinformation? I mean, even informed people, like, why do we fall for misinformation?
there is a lot of cognitive security research on this. Again, it's sales funnels. So it helps to understand how marketing works, how sales works, and it helps to understand things like segmentation. So a lot of this is beautifully targeted. Again, when we're looking at how we bring people out, you don't have just one group, you have multiple groups. They need dignity, they need paths away. Quite often different groups need treating in different ways. There are going to be some hardcore people, but there are also people who just got caught up in this. So, I mean, that's, I guess, 30 seconds.
That's it. Now, we also have a real quick question. We have our joiner, Sam asks, sales funnels. Can you real quick, a sales funnel, what does that mean for those not familiar with it?
Okay, so it's a model of how you go from making somebody vaguely aware of your product to them buying the product to them evangelizing about your product. So it's just all the steps. And this has been incredibly well studied because people want to sell more stuff. And in this case, you're selling ideas.
Excellent. I think that is exactly, it's like the marketplace of ideas, the ecosystem. So I'm now going to pivot to Pablo and combine two questions as well, which is one, a question that we had about how do we solve the disconnects? This is from Daniel, about the disconnects between those that do security, cognitive security, and then the fact that misinformation, that usually people who practice cybersecurity aren't aware of how misinformation can disrupt them. And then the other question is, as more and more nation states get involved in this, how can we counter the threat? Again, recognizing 90 seconds is probably not enough time. First, how do we solve the disconnect between cybersecurity community and misinformation community? And then are there steps that you think we can do to counter the threat? Pablo.
Well, part of the way that we actually solve that disparity is that we do what we're doing now. We're talking about it. I will say something a little bit radical and say that all cyber attacks are misinformation attacks on some level. It used to be spear phishing, right? Click this link, open this email to give me access to your network. Now I'm getting you to buy a message so you'll buy into my community and my worldview. So I think certainly talking about it, 4 years ago when Sarah Jane and I started talking about this, people thought that we were crazy. They thought there was no disinformation problem. And now you see it covered on the nightly news. So I think we're moving in the right direction there. I think one of the things that need to do is cybersecurity people are really good about running exercises and running tabletops. I think misinformation needs to be one of the scenarios that they run, whether it targets their brand or some of their senior executives. And I apologize, I forgot what the other question was.
No, the other question, I think you actually addressed it, which was then, as other nation states get to do this, how can we solve it? I think you answered it in terms of we've got to make people realize all misinformation attacks are cybersecurity attacks and vice versa. These are not two separated worlds.
I do want to kind of foot stomp something that Rose said, is this is how geopolitics now occurs. You know, and you see the Chinese are very, very good at this. There's a reason that when they remade Red Dawn, the Chinese were taken out as being collaborators with the Russians as the bad guys, right? And that's because China has invested a lot of money in Hollywood to get their worldview across. And this is how geopolitics happens now.
Well said. All right, Rose, we're going to go to you before we shift to the lightning round to close. These are two questions. One was from Daniela, who said, on the one hand, we want to address inequities in our society and inequalities. We need to expand connectivity to all areas. But as you pointed out earlier, that could expose security concerns. Do we have guiding principles for rolling out the connectivity, but also thinking that it doesn't become a source of exploitation? And then sort of related to this, on the security side, if China was to hack Facebook, who would be liable for the disclosure of personalized information? Again, 90 seconds might be difficult to do, but maybe first, if you could give us your thoughts about, are there guiding points as we roll out internet connectivity to make sure it's not a negative to people's lives?
I love that question. I'm a huge proponent of what I call accountability ecosystems. Thinking about all of this as broader ecosystem, what are the things in society that will help people play an active role? Bevan mentioned this in the context of education. Do people even know what questions they're supposed to be asking? So what does that ecosystem look like? Certainly it's individual literacy and education, but that also includes investment and support for journalism that is capable of asking the right questions about the technology itself, about the business models, academics that are funded and capable of doing longer form research. So we're not just dependent on companies spending money to facilitate an academic set of research that serves their own purposes, which eventually runs into some ethical questions. And doing that in communities and with communities that are most affected, whether that's within the United States or, as I mentioned, all around the world. I'm encouraged that there's an incredible array of organizations that are pushing this and capable of doing this. And it's my hope that as we have conversations about increasing connectivity and addressing the potential ills and misuse of the internet and technology writ large, that we can approach it from that dual vantage point. Anytime we talk connectivity, let's talk accountability ecosystems as well. And the second question.
It was more of a hypothetical, but if Facebook gets hacked by China, who's responsible?
I'm laughing because I was at the State Department during the OPM hack. So first of all, China already has all of my information.
Exactly.
IFM has large portions of Facebook's information. But I actually think one of the things, we tend to focus on Facebook like it's the big catch-all boogeyman, which is not exactly fair. And I think there's this mid-level that most people are unaware of that is the ad market. So there's, large portions of the venture capital system is funding an entire industry that Americans and people the world over have never heard of, which exists solely to either get margins of better accuracy on ad targeting and data matching a person to another person. And they're selling data constantly between each other, and frankly are under much less pressure than Facebook to have decent cybersecurity and cyber hygiene practices. So A, I just assume China already has access to all of it. And B, the question of liability is a really interesting and important one that goes into that bigger conversation about how we define rights and responsibilities online and in technology more broadly, hopefully through a regulatory discussion.
Very well said. And to your point, it may very well be they don't even need to compromise the data. They may just be able to buy it anyway. And so who needs to, resort? And then to Pablo's point too, we are increasingly seeing this intersection where misinformation and cyber events happen, and it's sort of spinning, did something occur or not, the vagueness of this. And so this is a very challenging world. To the team, I want to give you props. We got more than 33 questions. We got through half of them, but I think this points to we may need to do a follow-up GeoTech Hour and involve our DFRL partners, because we seem to have a lot of Q&A from this. But we're going to pivot now to the closing lightning round, and it really is going to be about what you recommend to either policymakers, private sector CEOs, or the general public that we need to do next. And I'm going to actually amplify a question that we got from Sam in this that says, what are things that we're either not paying enough attention to, countermeasures we should be recommending more strongly, or action steps from this? I'd like to go first to Bevan. Again, sorry to put a time constraint on it. You got 90 seconds. What are 2 or 3 tangible things that you recommend we do as a result of these conversations today?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the first things we need to take a look at, keep rolling back to it, is making sure that what you do and how you do it is presented visibly and publicly to anyone who comes to any product online, right? So you need to know exactly what you're giving up and what the end result could be. So you want to make sure that you're going to the right places and so forth, because I've spoken to a lot of parents, going back to the question previously, that has a lot of concerns about their kids getting online and what they're downloading. So there's no barrier there. So that's one of the first things I would like to bring to the table is transparency. The second thing I would like to bring to the table is the same part again, is the data collection and how we regulate the companies and how we also punish some of the companies that are not doing the right things. And the third thing is how do we keep them compliant? How do we keep checks on them to make sure that they're actually going down the right path and doing the right things, and it's not harming the population or presenting something that's negative that can cause more harm moving forward. So these are the things I think we need to take a look at deeply as we move to the next stage.
Excellent. Thank you, Bevan. And as always, really appreciate all the positive work you're doing as well. Would now like to pivot next to SJ. So SJ, your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations in terms of either things we're not looking at or paying attention to that we should, or action steps we should do to be more proactive.
Okay, first, do disinformation risk analysis. I want the harms, the severities, the targets, the drivers. Don't just respond when you do it. Mitigate early understand the effects and the scales, not just of the disinformation, but also of your mitigations to it. And coordinate responses, include everyone can help with this, without, of course, overloading them. The second thing is to focus on behaviors, not people. So segment your audiences and understand that people caught up in disinformation, they're part of your communities. Help give them a safe route out of disinformation narratives. And the third one is to fix the information deserts. Information ecosystems are important. This is just part of those ecosystems. So get information into the places that people are looking for information. And at the moment, they're just finding disinformation. We've got to fix things like the local news ecosystem. I'm done.
Excellent, SJ. And again, truly appreciate, again, you really are the grand dame of countering misinformation. Thank you for all you do as a positive change agent in this space. Would now like to go to Pablo. So Dr. Brewer, your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations for us.
Okay, for the average citizen, I would recommend a couple of things. The first one is that you should follow people that espouse views that make you uncomfortable. Democracy doesn't work without civil discourse, and if you don't have a common ground with which to start that civil discourse, we're just not going to make it. So please get out of your own echo chamber, get out of your comfort zone, follow people that say things that absolutely enrage you, and then get to know them and engage in civil discourse. If you're a user on social media and you have the ability through either GDPR or CCPA, ask for the information that's being collected on you. Legally, they must provide that to you. I think you will be very surprised and not in a good way. For industry, put together public-private partnerships to advise policymakers on what the right legal regulations could and should be. I agree with Rose. All these conversations are Section 230 right now because that's what we have. Historically, Western law has been very rearward facing. We've waited for the incident and then the law, and then we've regulated it. We can no longer afford to do that. We need to be a bit more forward-leaning in government to do that. And the last one is, I really think the freemium model is morally unsustainable, and we have got to find another way.
Very powerful statements. And one, again, thank you, Pablo, both for your service that you've done for several years. Look forward to the chapters heading with you, and hope, again, like you said, public-private partnerships, possibly this place called the Atlantic Council, but other places as well, might be opportunities to move this forward. So thank you, Pablo, for all that you do. Rose, you get to bring it home for us. What would be your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations, either for things that we're missing that are on the horizon or action steps we should think about going forward?
Thank you. I think things that we're missing, it's fascinating to me that we fail to engage or have conversations about the gaming industry as a major part of social media and the ecosystem that we are looking at. That becomes even more important when you consider that that industry is funding or building itself artificial reality and virtual reality technologies that are likely to become ubiquitous. So starting to look forward towards the technologies that we will continue to live our lives on and thinking about what we want those to look like and creating the space to have a proactive conversation. To not just be yelling in the future about what we wish had happened. I think this is the most boring thing I could say, but I can't stress enough how important it is. Our government structures right now are not set up to help us address these issues. And part of everyone's frustration with the lack of a cogent conversation on regulation is because whether we're talking Congress, where there are 6 or 7 different jurisdictional committees, or the US government, where there are laws actually preventing what many of you are asking to happen in bringing coherence and addressing both foreign and domestic related mis and disinformation, it's time that we actually get these structures right and we get the connections we need, whether that is between people having discussions about antitrust and content moderation and privacy, or that community having conversations with the foreign policy and national security world. I'm hopeful that we can do that. The final thing that I would say is absolutely taking ownership of these issues. And my personal advice to everyone that is asking questions is I think there's a tendency when it comes to technology to discourage people from engaging by saying it's too complicated, you don't get it. And that's people hiding behind the fact that they don't have good answers. So even if you're feeling like it's too complicated and too technical and you don't know if you're asking the right thing, you're probably asking the right thing. These are questions about society and people, and we need to have more open and real discussions. So as an individual, take hold of this. Think of this as an important issue that you own, and you should demand answers from companies and your government on, and let's push forward.
Very well said, Rose. And I really appreciate that last remark that you said, that the hard work is possibly seen as the boring work, but it's the work we have to do, which is our very system is not geared up to respond to this. I want to thank all of you as panelists. As someone who actually, and I know, Rose, you had this too, and Pablo, actually probably all of us have had experiences, but myself personally, I did have an experience in 2017 when I had the early vanguard of tackling the challenges of the political pressures where misinformation were dominating, the shiny was dominating the more boring thing, which is we are trying to get our society to work together. And it's unclear, as Pablo indicated, whether or not open societies will continue to thrive in the decade ahead or more autocratic nations will thrive because they simply don't care about multiple narratives being out there. And so I raise that because you all give me hope. Hopefully we'll have a follow-up because again, we seem to still be getting comments and questions in. And so there definitely may need to be a follow-up round 2 of this discussion. I want to thank SJ, Rose, Pablo, and Bevan for all that you do as positive change agents. I want to thank the audience that joined us for these fascinating questions you have. For those of you that we didn't have a chance to get to, we do hope to circle back. And as always, for all of you trying to make a positive difference in the world, thank you. Be bold, be brave, and be benevolent for the future ahead. We'll see you next time.